Did you know that the United States once had a plan to invade Canada, not once, but multiple times? And did you know the design of Washington, D.C. was inspired by Paris, with its wide boulevards and grand public spaces meant to rival European capitals? Or that the iconic U.S. flag was designed by a 17-year-old high school student in 1958 for a school project? Okay, let's dive into the untold story of the USA with Mr. History. Colonial America began with a mix of hope, survival, and conflict. Jamestown, established in 1607 in Virginia, was the first permanent English settlement, but its early years were disastrous. Out of over 100 settlers, only 38 survived the first year due to disease, starvation, and harsh conditions. The colony was saved when John Rolfe introduced tobacco cultivation. Tobacco became so lucrative it turned Jamestown into a booming economy, but it also fueled the transatlantic slave trade, as plantations required large labor forces. Before Jamestown, the lost colony of Roanoke remains one of history's biggest mysteries. Founded in 1587, this was the very first colony in the USA that disappeared without a trace by 1590, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a tree. Some believe the settlers joined Native American tribes, others suspected they perished from starvation or conflict. By contrast, the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 at Plymouth, seeking religious freedom but finding brutal hardships. Nearly half of the group died before their first winter, yet they managed to establish a fragile community with the help of the Wampanoag people. Squanto, a Native American who had previously been enslaved in Europe, played a crucial role in teaching them to grow corn and fish. This corporation led to the first Thanksgiving, though it was far from the romanticized tale often told, because decades later tensions escalated into bloody conflicts like King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, devastating for both sides. As the colonies expanded, they developed distinct identities. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies stretched along the East Coast, driven by promises of land, religious freedom, and economic opportunity. The settlers, however, faced challenges far beyond nature. Indigenous people resisted the encroachment on their lands, while European powers competed for influence in the New World. Life for women in these colonies was unimaginably harsh. In Jamestown, women were scarce at first, so single men could essentially buy a wife for 150 pounds of tobacco. These women endured back-breaking labor, abuse, and often died young. A chilling law passed in 1662 allowed men to dunk their wives underwater if they were deemed too argumentative. Colonial America was also marked by increasing tensions with Britain. The colonies were treated as sources of revenue and raw materials. This economic exploitation angered many colonists who saw Britain's constant taxation as unfair and oppressive. Britain wasn't just taxing goods like tea and paper, no, they were also controlling trade through strict laws like Navigation Acts, which required all colonial exports to go through British ports. This stifled economic freedom and made it clear that the colonies were seen as mere pawns in Britain's global empire. Tensions boiled over with the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed nearly every piece of printed paper in the colonies. Imagine being taxed for newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. It felt like an attack on daily life itself. Things escalated with the Townshend Acts of 1767, which added taxes on essentials like glass, lead, and paint. The colonies protested fiercely, organizing boycotts and forming secret groups like the Sons of Liberty. One of the most shocking moments, though, came in 1770 when British soldiers fired on an unarmed crowd in the Boston Massacre, killing 5 colonists. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was propaganda fuel sparking outrage across the colonies. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 took rebellion to the next level. Colonists disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded British ships and dumped entire shipments of tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act. Colonists dumped over 92,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. Adjusted for today's money, that's over $1 million worth of tea lost to the waters. This wasn't a spontaneous act, it was carefully planned, a bold middle finger to Britain's authority. By 1775, the situation exploded into the Revolutionary War with the battles of Lexington and Concord. The colonies didn't initially seek full independence, they sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, who rejected it outright. But by July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, formally breaking ties with Britain and laying the groundwork for modern democracy. The war ended in 1781 with the decisive victory at Yorktown, where French naval forces played a critical role. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 finally recognized the United States as independent. But here's a twist. Britain didn't fully leave American territory until years later, despite the treaty. They even encouraged Native American resistance against the young nation. Now, the challenges of uniting 13 states under one government were immense, as each state had its own laws, currencies, and priorities. Initially, the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, served as the nation's first constitution, creating a loose confederation of states with a weak central government. The Confederation Congress lacked the power to enforce laws, regulate commerce, or collect taxes, leading to widespread financial instability and conflicts between states over issues like territorial disputes and trade. Recognizing these weaknesses, delegates convened the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles. Instead, they created a new framework of government, the U.S. Constitution. It established a federal government with three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial, ensuring a balance of power through checks and balances. The Constitution also addressed continuous issues like representation, culminating in the Great Compromise, which balanced representation in Congress between populous and smaller states. To address concerns about individual freedoms, the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. This set of 10 amendments guaranteed essential liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, forming the bedrock of American democracy and addressing fears of centralized power. Well, westward expansion in the United States was driven by the powerful ideal of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to spread across the continent. This mindset fueled extraordinary growth, but also deep conflicts. One of the earliest moves came with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where the U.S. acquired vast territory from France, doubling its size overnight. But here's something you might not know. This deal only happened because Napoleon needed cash to fund his wars in Europe and had just lost control of Haiti after a massive slave revolt. Without Haiti, the French Empire and the Americans fell apart. The Lewis and Clark expedition followed, mapping these new lands and establishing relationships with indigenous tribes. The journey was treacherous, and their guide, Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman sold into marriage, was instrumental. Her knowledge of the terrain and ability to communicate with native groups often meant the difference between survival and disaster. Amazingly, Sacagawea did all this while carrying her infant son on her back. But westward expansion wasn't just a story of opportunity, it had devastating consequences. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced entire tribes off their land. The Trail of Tears, one of the darkest chapters, saw tens of thousands of Native Americans marched hundreds of miles to designated Indian territory. Many died from disease, starvation, and exposure. This policy wasn't just about land, it was also tied to the expansion of slavery. As settlers moved west, they brought enslaved laborers with them, entrenching slavery in newly acquired territories. Westward expansion also fueled the nation's gold fever. The 1849 gold rush in California drew hundreds of thousands of migrants, but here's a shocking twist. California legalized Native American slavery in 1850 under the guise of protecting indigenous people. This law allowed Native Americans without employment papers to be auctioned off, showing how greed corrupted even supposed free territories. Manifest destiny and expansion shaped the United States into a continental power, but it came at an enormous human cost. These contradictions, freedom for some and oppression for others, planted the seeds of the Civil War, which grew from deep economic, social, and political divides between the North and the South. While the northern states embraced industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, the South remained rooted in an agrarian economy heavily dependent on enslaved labor to sustain its booming cotton industry. By 1860, the South's economy, intertwined with slavery, generated immense wealth, with 4 million enslaved individuals working on plantations. Yet only a small fraction of white Southerners, about 350,000, owned enslaved people, illustrating the disproportionate influence of wealthy elites on regional politics. The conflict over slavery extended into new territories gained through westward expansion, inflaming tensions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, led to violent clashes, notably Bleeding Kansas. Southern fears of losing political power intensified with Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, whose platform opposed the expansion of slavery. 11 Southern states seceded, forming the Confederacy and sparking the Civil War in 1861. The war itself, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a brutal and transformative conflict. One turning point was the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, which marked the Confederacy's last major offense in the North. Another was President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued after the Union's victory at Antietam. This measure reframed the war as a fight against slavery, rallying international support and paving the way for enlistment of 186,000 black soldiers in the Union Army. These soldiers contributed significantly to Union victories, even as they faced racism and segregation within the military. Reconstruction after the war, 1865 to 1877, was a turbulent period. After the Union's victory, efforts focused on rebuilding the South and securing rights for freed African Americans. Amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, and 15th, abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and protected voting rights. However, progress faced severe backlash. The rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the implementation of Jim Crow laws reversed many gains, leading to a segregated society. Then, the Industrial Revolution transformed the United States in the late 19th century, catapulting it into a period of extraordinary economic growth and technological innovation. Cities swelled and rural populations and immigrants poured into urban areas, seeking opportunities in rapidly expanding industries like steel, railroads, and textiles. By 1920, more than half of the U.S. population lived in urban areas, marking a significant societal shift from agrarian life to urban industrial living. The steel industry, fueled by processes like the Bessemer and open hearth methods, became the backbone of industrialization. U.S. steel production skyrocketed from 13,000 tons in 1860 to over 24 million tons annually by 1910, making the United States the world's leading steel producer. This surge enabled the growth of skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads, including the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which spanned 200,000 miles by the century's end. Railroads not only revolutionized transportation, but also stimulated industries like coal, iron, and timber, creating a nationwide network of trade and economic interdependence. Invention thrived during this period, fundamentally altering daily life. Thomas Edison's light bulb illuminated homes and factories, while Alexander Graham Bell's telephone revolutionized communication. Immigration played a pivotal role in fueling industrial growth. Between 1870 and 1920, more than 26 million immigrants arrived, many settling in cities and providing the labor forces needed for the industrial boom. However, these opportunities came with challenges. Overcrowded tenements, child labor, and exploitative working conditions were widespread. By the time we reached the end of World War I, America's industrial might and resource wealth solidified its emergence as a global power. But then the country faced a devastating economic collapse. The Great Depression, beginning with the 1929 stock market crash, devastated the U.S. economy, with unemployment reaching 25% and widespread poverty gripping the nation. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal introduced reforms like societal security and public works projects to rebuild the economy. The crisis reshaped government roles in economic regulation and set the stage for recovery through World War II's industrial demands, which eventually revitalized the U.S. economy and propelled the nation towards global leadership. Well, the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union defined much of the mid-20th century. Emerging from ideological divides after World War II, it was a tense rivalry marked by espionage, proxy wars, and a nuclear arms race. A defining moment came in 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis, when US intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war until a tense diplomatic resolution was reached. The Soviet Union withdrew the missiles, and the US secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The Cold War also spurred scientific ambition, epitomized by the space race. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the US responded by prioritizing space exploration. This competition led to incredible achievements, like the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. Meanwhile, domestic focus shifted towards civil rights. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks inspired millions to challenge segregation and systematic racism. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became landmark achievements, banning racial discrimination and protecting voting rights. However, progress was hard-won. Events like the 1963 Birmingham church bombing revealed the deep societal tensions underlying the movement. As the 21st century unfolded, the US faced a series of monumental challenges and transformations. The 9/11 attacks in 2001 were a pivotal moment, radically shifting the nation's foreign policy and security landscape. These events led to the War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and eventually Iraq. The economic repercussions of 9/11 were also immense, with the cost of these wars exceeding $6 trillion and causing significant disruptions, including the destruction of 18,000 small businesses in New York alone. Yet, in the midst of these challenges, the US also experienced remarkable technological advancements. The rise of companies like Apple and Google revolutionized the tech industry, sparking a new digital era. At the same time, the US found itself facing new challenges at home, with political divisions deepening and debates over issues like healthcare, climate change, and immigration becoming increasingly heated. Yet, despite these struggles, the US continued to exert enormous influence on the world stage, particularly through its leadership in global innovation and culture. From Silicon Valley's cutting-edge developments to Hollywood's global reach, America remained a cultural powerhouse, shaping global trends and technological progress. Looking ahead, how will the US navigate the challenge of the next era? Can it continue to lead in technology and innovation, or will emerging powers reshape the global order? Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. History for more insights into the ongoing story of the United States.